As you all may be aware already, the May 2023 ban list is coming in the next few weeks, most likely, and I think now is a good time to talk about what I think could and should get hit on the next ban list, considering we've had a bit of time with Cyberstorm Access being out to see how sort of the old and the new decks mesh together in this format, to see what has become a problem and if things have gotten a little better for some things that used to be problems. So yeah, with that being said, let's just hop straight into the video. So I'm going to start off by discussing what I think Konami is going to try to do with this ban list. So the first goal is to deal with any overly oppressive cards or decks. So of course there are things at the forefront of the meta like KASHTIRA, which people definitely want to get hit, and you can argue it is quite oppressive with its 5 zone lock. But the reason I point this out is because there are a lot of cards that definitely should get hit, and there can be an argument for those cards to get hit. So just off the top of my head, Floodgates like Skill Drain and whatnot, or like the virus cards, like things like that. Like, yes, those cards are very good, but since they aren't overly oppressive, since you're not playing them in every single deck, you're not going to see them that often. But I don't think those cards are personally going to get hit on this ban list. Next up, I think they're going to try to weaken some older meta decks, strengthen some older rogue decks, and sort of try to push the new meta decks out there. So if you remember before Cyberstorm Access, the format was like RUNICK, Naturia, like Sprite variants, KASHTIRA, stuff like that. So I think they're going to try to somewhat weaken those decks, while also maybe boosting some rogue decks by releasing some cards off the ban list, just so we have a more diverse format, because I'm pretty sure they want to encourage a format where a lot of things are playable, and I understand that it isn't like the best thing necessarily for the competitive game as a competitive player, where you have to deal with many different possible types of decks, but I think by doing so it encourages sort of more people to try different things out, and I think that's sort of what Konami would be trying to do. Before we go any further, I just want to quickly preface, this is all my opinion and my opinion only, so do keep that in mind. With that being said, let's just hop straight into the cards. So I think this one is almost unanimous. Most people would agree with that number 89 Diablosis, the Mind Hacker, should get banned. Of course, this is a hit to the KASHTIRA deck, because this card is incredibly powerful in the deck, giving you information on what your opponent's playing, ripping out key extra deck monsters, but perhaps most importantly, facilitating the zone lock combo, because resolving its effect essentially allows you to lock 2 zones with Shangri-Ira during turn 1, which is a lot, considering turn 1 you can't really consistently activate like Unicorn or FENRIR effects to actually banish stuff face down, making it a lot easier to use Shangri-Ira on the first and actually start locking zones. So by removing this card, I think it makes the zone lock a lot more difficult, which is very good, because the zone lock essentially is like an FTK, considering there aren't too many like things that can actually stop it. Also, removing this makes it so people's extra decks can be a tiny bit more flexible, since the only thing left to rip stuff out of the extra deck is Unicorn's effect, and you can always find a way to play around that. So I think Diablosis definitely a plausible hit, and a hit that should happen to KASHTIRA. Next up is Branded Expulsion, and I know a lot of people are going to say yes, you can still do the Gimmick Puppet lock and stuff like that, and that's true. You can use the new Albion, the Sanctifier Dragon Fusion, to do that. But the reason I'd say hit Expulsion is because Expulsion is just, I feel like, a lot more accessible. It's just more free. So like you can set it in end phase off of Albion, whereas for something like Albion, the Incandescent Dragon, you actually have to like go out of your way to summon that and set it up, make it so potentially different parts of your board are a bit weaker than, for example, just dumping an Albion and Albion end phase setting Expulsion for free. I definitely think going after this card specifically is good, because you can't really go after like the Gimmick Puppet and stuff like that, because there are always degenerate cards like that your opponent could just give to you and you still not be able to play the game. So it doesn't really solve that problem, but by hitting Expulsion and pretty much making it so the only way to actually do the lock consistently is with the new Sanctifier Dragon, just makes it a little bit more manageable, since there are a few more outs like monsters than there are trap cards, considering we don't have a card like Red Reboot left. So overall, I think Expulsion is definitely a great hit to a deck like Branded. Takes away a bit of its degeneracy. Yes, I understand it can still do the lock, but at least this way it'll be a little bit more manageable for the other decks out there. And then finally, I want to talk about like Floodgate type card effects. I briefly alluded to this earlier, but cards like Droll and Lockbird, Dimension Shifter, Dimensional Barrier, Harpy's Featherstorm, these are all very strong lingering effects, which I think are one of the most broken things in the game. Incredibly frustrating to deal with because once they resolve, you can't do anything about them. There's very few cards that can actually counter them. Like if you think about it, it's just like Droll and Lockbird and Shifter. It's essentially Called by the Grave and Crossout Designator only, and even less for a card like Dimensional Barrier and Harpy's Featherstorm is just Crossout, but that isn't really feasible. So despite these cards not having a lot of outs to them, I think these probably won't get hit at the end of the day. You can make an argument that cards like Droll and Lockbird and Dimension Shifter kind of act as a check to some decks out there, because without these cards, then some decks are just way too strong. The hand traps that we do have just aren't enough to stop them. Like if you think about a card like Nibiru the Primal Being, so many decks can actually either play through it or play around it, set up like a Nick before you get the chance to Nibiru, and that just makes it so difficult for decks going second to play. So I think for that reason, they're probably going to keep these card effects. Do I personally think these should get hit? Probably yes, but do I think they will get hit? I don't think so. Moving on to the limited section, I think another hit to KASHTIRA would be warranted considering it was the most dominant deck before the Cyberstorm Axis meta. I think they would either hit Unicorn or Fenrir, most likely Unicorn I'd say, just because that's a KASHTIRA specific hit. They might want to leave Fenrir because you can play Fenrir in different some other decks. But I could also see them hitting Fenrir as well instead of limiting Unicorn, just so you can't splash into other decks. I think you can make an argument for both sides, but either way, I feel like one of the main deck KASHTIRA monsters are going to get hit, but probably not both unless they really want to hurt the deck. So I would say as a safe pick, probably Unicorn would be the one to get hit. Just to reduce the consistency of KASHTIRA just a little bit more in addition to Mind Hacker, just so it's a bit more manageable. Of course, KASHTIRA is still going to be a great deck because a Rise Heart is still so incredibly powerful and it's so oppressive for so many decks to deal with, so the deck will still have its main win condition, but now you won't have to deal with like the 5 Zone Lock that often, for example, and your opponent won't always have these spell extenders that you can grab off Unicorn. Next up is Runick Fountain or Runick Tip. So like I mentioned, Runick Naturia was a very strong deck before. There are also other Runick variants like Runick Sprite and stuff, so this is sort of like a hit to them as well. I think hitting either one is fine. Hitting Fountain just means its recursion and grind game is a lot worse now, because if their one Fountain essentially leaves the field, it's going to be pretty difficult for them to get it back if it's banished with a card like Cosmic Cyclone, for example. So I think that could be pretty fair, just to have an answer to their recursion, because the Runick cards are so good, not because like they trade one for one, but like because you have this recursion with Runick Fountain that you just constantly get resources and snowball out of control from there. So I think definitely hitting Runick Fountain could be a great hit to the deck. Same thing with Tip. You can use this to reduce the consistency. At the end of the day, it's not going to kill the engine, like the engine's still going to be good, just because you could put back Tip with Runick Fountain all the time, but now just make it so you're less likely to draw this super powerful one-of card that essentially just lets you grab any Runick card in your deck, which is just super powerful and adds a lot of consistency to any deck that adds Runick as an engine. So I think hitting either one of these is fine. Definitely not both. I don't think this engine is that oppressive anymore. It's not really being played that much in the new format. So I think realistically, like, you don't have to hit it, but if they were to hit it, it'd probably be one of these in my opinion. Next up is Sprite Starter. This is sort of another slap on the wrist hit, and that's sort of like the theme I'm going to assume they're going to go with. Just slap on the wrist type of hits to these like old meta decks to push these new meta decks out there. So by hitting Sprite Starter to 1, it makes it so like more pure Sprite builds are a little bit less consistent and a little bit more vulnerable now, because you're not going to be able to have this powerful extender as often to be able to play through different hand traps, making the Sprite engine just a little bit more fragile, and I think that's going to be a fair hit to the deck. You can still play Sprite as an engine, because most engines would either play one starter already or just no starter at all, making it so it doesn't really kill the deck at all, but rather it just makes it so every Sprite variant is just a little bit more vulnerable to interruptions now, and I think that's a pretty fair hit to Sprite. So the next thing we're going to talk about is ORCUST HARP Horror. So I think that's going to be all for like the old meta deck hits. I don't think anything else really needs to be hit, considering where the format is right now and considering what we're seeing in terms of like the meta. I think what I've proposed is fair to hit in those decks. It wouldn't really kill any of those decks, but it definitely make way for some new decks to come to the format. And speaking of new decks in the format, I think bringing ORCUST HARP Horror back to 1 is pretty good. It's definitely not going to be that oppressive if KASHTIRA, as long as KASHTIRA is a thing. Like, these graveyard-based decks are going to inherently struggle a little bit, and I think ORCUST is no exception. Bringing back ORCUST could be cool because you could maybe mix it in some different decks, and it can add like a really cool engine to end on a card like ORCUST Crescendo or ORCUST Babel to actually do stuff. And I think ORCUST as a deck right now isn't that strong as it was a few years ago. So even if you are playing like a pure ORCUST deck and go first, I don't think this card is going to make it so suddenly your deck is just like top of the meta and your board is like impossible to break. I don't think that's really a thing, and I think by bringing ORCUST HARP Horror back, it can introduce a potential new deck to the meta, which would be really nice to see. On a similar note, PERFORMAGE PLUSHFIRE, maybe a little bit less so, because I'm not sure how relevant this card would be nowadays. You could potentially loop it maybe like twice a turn from what I'm seeing, like maybe 3 times, but even if you do that, there are a lot of decks that just spam out monsters on the board nowadays, and I don't think PLUSHFIRE is that as broken as it was back in the day. So I definitely think you could bring this back just to push pendulums a little bit, because pendulums have been a struggling archetype. I mean pendulums like as an actual like pure deck, not like pendulum cards themselves, but like as a pure deck, maybe like PERFORMAGE Magicians, for example, just haven't been doing much in the format, and I think it's always been a rogue option. It can always do something, but just giving them that little extra potential boost might be able to help them. Alright, so moving on to the unlimited section now. I don't think any cards need to be semi-limited. The only card really that should be semi-limited is Destiny Hero Malicious, and I still believe that. We are going to move Desires from 2 to 3. I think this is good because it just gives some consistency to other decks out there. Most of the top decks, like if you think about like Super Heavy Samurai, Manadium, Pearly, like aside from KASHTIRA, essentially, like you probably aren't seeing too many decks that are on Desires, much less like would play 3 in their deck even if they could. So I don't think this card would really break any deck in the format. It helps some rogue decks with consistency, which is nice. Even if it's at 3, like some people may still be hesitant to play it if KASHTIRA is a thing, just because of the risk of getting punished by decking you out with like a Rise Art or something, for example. So I don't think Pot of Desires would be overly oppressive at all, and definitely be a nice boost to some decks out there. And I just don't understand why this card was at 2 in the first place. I think 3 is where it's supposed to be. Oh, and just as a quick note, like you could say this card is somewhat maybe power crept by like Pot of Prosperity in a sense. So just giving decks the option to either play consistency cards like Prosperity or Desires would make it really good, because now you have the option to play either or if your deck can't support one or the other. Next up is Miscellaneosaurus at 3. I think specifically this would help dinos quite a bit. And the reason I want to say helping dinos be good is because dinos are inherently a going second deck, and that's something we don't really have too much of in Yu-Gi-Oh! At the moment, to my knowledge at least. Just introducing another going second card or another going second deck into the format can be great to promote a little bit more diversity. Yes, the dinos are a very powerful deck, and with 3 Miscellaneosaurus they can be incredibly strong, but I don't think like inherently going second it's going to be very feasible for them to always break through the boards that are out there. So I think having Miscellaneosaurus back to 3 isn't too bad of an idea. Yes, it does introduce some things for it going first, but there's so many combo decks out there right now that if they go first they can still make a powerful combo. So I don't think saying dinos are like going to be this insane going first deck now is really going to make it so you wouldn't want to bring Miscellaneosaurus back. You could also make the argument that it should stay limited, so I'm sort of on the fence about this one, but I could definitely see Miscellaneosaurus to 3 as a very reasonable way to bring another deck back into the format. Speaking of bringing decks back to the format, I think Gazelle can come back to 3. I'm pretty sure this deck is just outclassed by Mathmech in almost every single way, like going first boards, breaking boards, going second. I just think Mathmech is just a better Cybers deck, and I don't think Salamangreat is going to make that big of a splash in the meta, even if they do get everything back. I think if Gazelle comes back to 3, that'll be everything for Salamangreat off the list, to my knowledge. But even then, I still don't think it'd be a very strong deck. It might be like a okay like tier 2 deck at best, but like I mentioned, I just think Mathmech is just better in every single way. So if you're gonna let Mathmech survive, then I don't think you really need to keep Salamangreat limited by just keeping Gazelle at 1. So I definitely think Gazelle could go to 3. And then finally, the last card I'm going to talk about is SEKKA'S Light. SEKKA'S Light is interesting, and I know some people are going to say, oh, you can play this Super Heavy Samurai, that make them broken, but no, you actually can't, because you can't activate spell effects except SEKKA'S Light after you activate it. So that means you can't use your pendulums, and you can't use like the equipped Super Heavy Samurais. And that's pretty big, because those are pretty important parts of the deck, so Super Heavy Samurai wouldn't be able to play this anyways. This is here more so to encourage a little bit of more diversity in deck building, and sort of by bringing that extra diversity at the same time, you also make it easier to side deck. For example, a card like 5 Rainbow Magician now might be a lot better of a side deck card. And I know it's ironic I'm promoting a Mystic Mind like card or effect, but my point is, by bringing SEKKA'S Light back, you give players a little bit more creativity with their deck building. So now you can say, oh, is it worth cutting maybe like 6 to 10 spell cards that I have in my deck for like 3 Pot of Greeds, and then but I can't play like other spells, or is it still worth just keeping those spells because they're so powerful? So I think that would be a really good option. You could make the argument that by introducing SEKKA'S Light back, you do let some, like, maybe some funky FDKs come back in, be a little more consistent. But I think with the amount of hand traps running around and the amount of combo decks that pretty much already win by going first, like, it doesn't really make that big of a difference, if at all. So I think by bringing SEKKA'S Light back, it could just allow some cool new decks to emerge. And I think this card is definitely not going to alter the meta by a lot, even if it does come back. So that's going to do it for the cards, but before I sign off, I just want to give a quick shout out to Your Playmat as well as CardTrader Zero. If you want to get your own custom playmats, tabletop mats, or card sleeves, then be sure to check out Your Playmat using my affiliate link in the description below for 10% off to help support the channel. As well as CardTrader Zero, if you want to stop paying exorbitant shipping fees on the cards you'd or be buying online, then sign up with my affiliate link below just to help support the channel even without making a purchase. So I'd really appreciate if you guys check them out. But yeah, with that being said, I just want to thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, let me know in the comment section below if there's any other cards you think that I missed, or if you agree, disagree with my opinions. And once again, just remember, this is my opinion and my opinion only, so I could be completely wrong on this. I could be completely misinformed about this, but yeah, just keep in mind that this is my opinion. But with that being said, I just want to thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you guys in the next one. Take care.